Hey guys, today we're stepping into a camp that feels more like a giant icebox than a place to rest. You duck under the edge of a stiff canvas flap and instantly the bite of winter air hits your face. The ground crunches beneath your boots, and the wind threads through the seams, tugging at every edge like mischievous fingers. It's dark except for a faint glow of embers in a shallow pit at the centre. You pull the flap closed behind you, but it doesn't help much. The cold still leaks in, sliding around you the way water seeps under a doorframe. Honestly, you probably wouldn't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment below telling me your location and the local time where you're watching this from. It always fascinates me to know who's awake in Tokyo at sunrise, or who's dozing off in Chicago at midnight. Now, as you stand in that tent, the first thing you notice is how heavy the air feels, damp, chilled, and carrying the sharp scent of smoke and wool. Medieval soldiers, merchants, and wanderers all knew this feeling. You trudge into a space where canvas walls flutter. Faintly, ropes creak under strain, and the distant howl of the wind outside presses like an invisible weight. This is your home for the night, a flimsy cloth barrier against a world where frost can bite deeper than any sword. Fact is, medieval people did manage to sleep in these conditions sometimes for weeks or even months during campaigns. The armies of Europe and beyond set up tented cities, sprawling clusters of canvas and timber, where men and women had to survive winter after winter. Unlike stone halls or cottages, tents offered little insulation, no matter how tightly woven fabric was still just fabric. So survival depended on technique improvisation, and sometimes sheer stubbornness. One quirky tidbit is that some tents weren't the tiny two-man pup tents you might imagine from modern camping. Noble tents could be enormous whole rooms under fabric with multiple poles and decorated walls. Think of it like glamping medieval edition Still Cold, but at least you had space for rugs, furniture, and perhaps even a servant or two to help manage the nightly chill. For common soldiers, though, you were lucky to share a canvas lean-to with 3 other snoring comrades. Historians still argue whether medieval tents were actually as miserable as we assume. Some accounts describe them as unbearably draughty and damp, barely better than sleeping in the open. Others hint that with proper layering straw bedding and fire pits, they could actually be tolerable, even cosy. The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in the middle. Soldiers grumbled, nobles exaggerated, and chroniclers wrote with whatever flair would impress their patrons. As you linger here, you start to notice little details, the sound of a rope straining in the wind, the dull thud of boots outside the low hum of someone muttering a prayer before bed. The sensory world of a medieval camp wasn't quiet. It was alive with overlapping noises. The canvas itself rasped with each gust, a constant reminder that nature was only a breath away. You feel the cold settle into your shoulders, into your jaw. You tug the hood of your cloak tighter, but even so the night seeps in, and yet people did fall asleep. Exhaustion helped, no doubt, after marching all day carrying heavy armour, or tending to livestock. You'd be so tired you could probably nap standing up. But tricks of the trade were already being used, bundling up in multiple layers, huddling close to others, even sipping warm drinks before crawling into bed. Nothing about it was luxurious, but it was survival. It's strange to think that in our modern lives we bundle ourselves under duvets in centrally heated rooms, and still complain about being chilly while medieval soldiers endured nights like this with only canvas wool and each other. Imagine being jostled awake not by an alarm clock, but by the flap of your tent wall slapping against the pole, or the crunch of frost under the boots of a guard changing shifts. Sleep wasn't always deep. It was shallow, broken, but still enough to carry you into the next day. You feel your eyelids getting heavy as you picture yourself lying on a rough mat of straw wrapped in wool, listening to the steady rhythm of the wind dragging along the canvas roof. The smell of smoke clings to your clothes, and every so often you hear the pop of an ember in the fire pit. It's not comfortable, but it's familiar, and you realize that familiarity might have been its own comfort. Still, there was more to the story. Keeping warm wasn't just about lying down, it was about what you wore, what you layered, and how you tucked yourself in. You might think it's obvious, just pile on more clothes, but the reality was a little trickier than that. You crouch low in the tent, your breath fogging the air as you tug at layers of rough wool and linen. This was the real secret to surviving the night. Not just any one garment, but the stacking of fabrics, each trapping a little more air, a little more warmth, like building your own personal fortress out of cloth. You'd start with a simple linen shirt, smooth, cool against the skin, not much insulation on its own, but it wicked away sweat. Sweat, after all, was dangerous here. If you went to bed damp, you might as well invite the frost into your bones. Over the linen came wool, scratchy heavy and always smelling faintly of sheep. Then another layer, maybe two. Medieval people loved to complain about the itch, but nobody ever froze to death because of itchy sleeves. The mainstream fact here is simple. Wool was king. Across Europe it was the most common textile precisely because it kept you alive. Wool fibres naturally trapped air, and even when damp they held warmth. A soldier in winter might wear a woolen tunic, then wrap a cloak of thicker wool on top and finally drape a blanket or fur if he had one. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. And if you picture yourself crawling under those layers, you realise it's not so different from piling extra quilts on your bed today, except these quilts were made by hand, dyed with natural colours, and maybe patched a dozen times before you got them. Here's the quirky tidbit: some medieval people actually slept in their daytime clothes boots and all. You might think that's lazy or unhygienic, but in reality it was strategy. The fewer times you exposed your bare skin to the cold, the better. And those boots, they kept your toes from freezing to the ground if you had to leap up suddenly. Imagine snoozing away half dreaming when a trumpet sounds outside. You wouldn't want to waste time fumbling for your leggings in the dark. Sleeping dressed was practical, even if it meant waking up smelling like a walking laundry pile. Of course historians still argue about the details. Did common soldiers really sleep in full kit armour pieces nearby, or did they strip down to underclothes for comfort? Some records describe soldiers wrapped tightly in cloaks, snoring boots on, while others suggest they kept a cleaner system, one set of linen for day, one for night, though clean was a relative term. The debate never quite resolves, and you realise the truth probably varied. A knight with squires might strip to a softer shift while servants kept watch, but a peasant-turned-soldier likely collapsed exactly as he was. You shift in your imaginary bedding, feeling the weight of layers press you down, and suddenly it's not just warmth, it's heaviness. A cocoon pinning you against the straw. And maybe that heaviness helped people sleep. Like being swaddled as a baby or like weighted blankets today, it pressed the body into calm submission. The rhythm of the wind outside, the faint creak of ropes and the musty scent of wool became a lullaby. Still, there were limits. Too many layers and you risked trapping sweat which could chill you to the bone. Too few and you froze. You can almost picture the medieval sleeper testing the balance cloak, pulled up blanket, folded hood, tugged low, then a sigh warm enough to survive till dawn. Or at least that was the hope. Your own mind drifts as you imagine the rustle of linen, the rough tickle of wool on your neck, the comforting weight of cloth pressing like an anchor against the endless night. But layering clothes wasn't enough on its own. Even wrapped like a human cabbage, you still needed another trick to keep the cold from creeping into your lungs. The fire pit glows faintly, a dull orange crater at the heart of the tent. You shuffle closer, but not too close. Everyone in the camp knows that fire is both friend and betrayer. It gives warmth, yes, but it also gives smoke, and smoke is the sly thief of air. A medieval tent wasn't built with modern chimneys or vent systems. Instead, you relied on a simple smoke hole at the top, a flap that could be propped open with a stick. If the wind was right, the smoke curled upward and escaped. If the wind was wrong, it swirled back down like a choking blanket. You sit cross-legged near the pit, watching sparks spit and fade, trying not to cough as the air thickens. The mainstream historical fact is straightforward. Almost all large medieval tents relied on open fire pits, or portable braziers for heat. These weren't just for cooking. They were the difference between numb fingers and a night where you could still feel your toes. Soldiers, pilgrims, and nobles alike built shallow pits in the dirt floor, lined them with stones, and fed them with whatever fuel was available, logs if they were lucky, peat, or dung if they weren't. The warmth was precious, even if it came with the cost of constant vigilance. Now for the quirky tidbit, sometimes soldiers preferred to let the fire die out before sleep, relying instead on the residual warmth in the ground. Why? Because falling asleep with smoke curling around you wasn't just uncomfortable, it could be deadly. There are scattered accounts of whole groups waking sluggish, dazed, or not waking at all, likely from carbon monoxide poisoning. The human body, it turns out, isn't well designed for dozing off in a smoke chamber. Some medieval soldiers joked dark humour, of course, that the fire was as dangerous as the enemy, which is the kind of punchline you only tell when your teeth are chattering and laughter makes clouds in the night air. Historians still argue how often fires truly burned inside tents at night. Some argue that most tents were too small and too flammable, so fire was strictly for cooking, not sleeping. Others point to larger noble tents, sometimes constructed with wooden frames, where braziers could be set up more safely, much like in a house. Chronicles mention grand campaigns where lords dined by firelight inside their pavilions, the smoke hole above them working like a rustic chimney. The truth probably depended on status. A noble's tent might glow golden with firelight, while the common soldier huddled in darkness, surviving on shared body heat and scratchy cloaks. You imagine the sensory reality, the sharp tang of wood smoke in your throat, the way your eyes sting after a few minutes. The flicker of fire on canvas walls creates moving shadows that look like figures shifting in the corners. Each pop of a burning log makes you flinch, half worried a spark might leap into the bedding. And always the uneasy balance, stay close enough to feel the heat, but not so close that you smother. It's hard not to compare this to modern camping. Today you might grumble if your portable heater runs out of batteries, or if your marshmallows catch fire instead of toasting evenly. But back then your heater was a small inferno you had to nurse like a pet dragon one that could cook your dinner and cook you too if you weren't careful. The tent wasn't just a bedroom. It was also a kitchen, a sitting room, and sometimes, unfortunately, a smokehouse. As you picture yourself lying on straw near that glowing pit, your breathing grows shallow. The smoke curls hypnotic, almost like waves rolling in and out. You close your eyes, the warmth hitting one cheek while the other stays cold. Your cloak smells of ash, your hair feels gritty, and yet you're grateful for this fragile comfort. Sleep creeps in, even if it means coughing awake now and then. But fire wasn't the only trick to beat the cold. Heat could rise from the earth or from strange little inventions tucked beneath you. And soon, you'll discover why medieval people lifted their beds off the ground altogether. You shuffle away from the fire pit, tugging your cloak tighter, and glance at the ground beneath you. It looks harmless enough, just packed earth with a scattering of straw, but in the dead of winter, that earth is a thief. It steals heat from your body the instant you lie down, pulling warmth into the soil, as if the earth itself is hungry. Medieval people knew this instinctively. Never sleep directly on frozen ground if you value your toes. That's why bed frames, yes, even in tents, mattered more than most people realize. The straightforward fact is this: sleeping raised off the ground was one of the simplest but most effective medieval survival strategies. Wooden frames, often crude and easily dismantled, lifted sleepers away from the damp soil, allowing air to circulate beneath. For nobles on campaign, carpenters travelled with the baggage train, setting up collapsible beds that looked surprisingly like modern cots. For common soldiers, improvisation ruled planks, branches, even shields laid flat to serve as a barrier. Anything to stop direct contact with the frozen earth. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some accounts describe soldiers using empty barrels as makeshift legs for their boards, creating what were essentially pop-up beds. Others dragged wagons into camp and slept inside them, treating the cart itself as a raised platform. And there are odd mentions of people trying to sleep on stacked saddles, hardly comfortable but apparently better than lying in frost. It's funny to imagine you wobbling on a precarious pile of gear, muttering that at least your bones won't freeze, even if your back will ache like an old mule's in the morning. Historians still argue how common actual bed frames were outside noble circles. Chronicles of royal campaigns gush about luxurious setups with velvet-draped beds carried from place to place. But how much of that filtered down to the average archer or spearman is debatable. Some scholars argue that most common soldiers had nothing more than straw mats on the ground, while others point to archaeological finds suggesting rudimentary wooden slats were widespread. The truth may be that soldiers used whatever was available, sometimes planks, sometimes nothing but a thick heap of bracken. Picture the sensation you climb onto a raised frame, creaky and uneven, but instantly the chill lessens. The cold no longer seeps relentlessly into your spine. The straw beneath your blanket feels less damp, less hostile. It's not comfort the way you know it. No soft mattress, no memory foam, but it's survival, and that's enough. You lie there, listening to the faint groan of the wood under your weight, almost lulled by its rhythm. And then consider the modern aside. Today we sleep on box spring slats or metal frames, all designed with airflow and comfort in mind. We call it engineering. They called it necessity. You'd laugh if you realized you and a medieval knight share the same complaint: the ground is too cold to sleep on. Maybe humans don't change as much as we think, we just upgrade the furniture. The wind rattles the canvas again, tugging you back into the tent's reality. The raised frame creaks. You nestle deeper under the cloak, grateful for the inches that separate you from the hungry soil. Sleep creeps closer, steady as the wind pressing at the walls. But of course wood alone couldn't keep you warm forever. Something else had to fill the space between you and the night, and that's when straw hay and bracken came into play. You lower yourself onto the bedding and instantly you hear it, a faint crunch like footsteps on autumn leaves. Beneath you is not a mattress, not feathers, not anything soft and luxurious, but straw. Straw hay, or sometimes bracken, the fern-like plants gathered from the edges of fields, served as the medieval sleeper's insulation. It wasn't glamorous. It poked, it scratched, and sometimes it smelled faintly of whatever livestock had trodden through it before. But it was the barrier between your body and the freezing air that seeped through the canvas walls. Without it, the night was unbearable. Here's the straightforward fact: straw was one of the most common forms of bedding across medieval Europe. It was cheap, plentiful, and easy to replace. Soldiers on campaign carried no bulky mattresses; those were for nobles. Instead, when they set up camp, they foraged whatever was nearby. A thick layer of straw trapped pockets of air, creating insulation much like a primitive sleeping pad today. Bracken was also a favourite, especially in woodland areas, since it was springy, less prickly than straw, and often gave off a pleasantly earthy scent. Now for the quirky tidbit: some armies actually organised straw duty. Men were sent out not to hunt or fight, but to gather hay or bracken for bedding. Without it, morale plummeted. Imagine an entire company of weary soldiers glaring at the poor fellow who forgot to collect enough straw. You'd be less worried about the enemy outside and more worried about your angry comrades inside. There are even anecdotes of soldiers stuffing straw into sacks to create makeshift pillows. Not exactly goose down, but at least your head wasn't resting directly on wood or dirt. Of course, historians still argue just how effective straw really was. Some believe it provided decent insulation and comfort, while others insist it quickly became damp, dirty, and crawling with vermin. Accounts vary. A noble's journal might praise a bed of fresh hay, while a soldier's letter might complain of the lice that bred faster than rabbits in the stuff. The truth probably depended on how fresh and dry the straw was. Replace it regularly, and it was tolerable. Let it sit too long, and you invited every itchy guest you never wanted. You shift in your imaginary bedding, listening to the rustle beneath you. The straw scratches your wrists, but it also cushions your bones from the hard planks of the bed frame. Close your eyes, and you can almost smell the mix of hay and smoke, that odd perfume of medieval camp life. It's not comfortable in the modern sense, but it's familiar grounding. And for a weary traveller, sometimes not terrible is as good as cozy. There's a curious parallel here to modern life. Campers today carry inflatable pads and high-tech sleeping mats, boasting about R values and insulation thickness. Medieval soldiers just grabbed whatever was growing underfoot. The ingenuity was the same, even if the technology was wildly different. And maybe in its simplicity, straw was even better. It biodegraded, it cost nothing, and you didn't have to blow it up with your lungs while your friends laughed at you. You roll onto your side, hear the straw crunch again, and feel the cold pressing at your blanket's edges. Yet your core stays warmer. You're grateful for this prickly mattress. It's not comfort, it's survival dressed as comfort. And as your breathing steadies, you realize there's still another layer to add. Cloth and straw were good, but sometimes survival meant reaching for something softer, warmer, and far more primal. That's when furs came into the picture. You tug the scratchy wool blanket higher, but it's not enough. The night air seeps through every seam of the tent, slipping past layers of linen and straw, nipping at your skin until you feel your bones ache. And then comes the real saviour, the fur cloak. Heavy, musky, and lined with the ghost of the animal it once belonged to, fur was the medieval sleeper's ace card. When nothing else could hold back, the cold fur did. Here's the mainstream fact: across medieval Europe, furs were prized not only as clothing, but as bedding. From peasant families huddling beneath sheepskins to nobles draped in fox sable or even ermine fur was the ultimate insulation. Its dense fibers trapped heat better than woven wool, and unlike straw, it didn't flatten beneath your body overnight. Soldiers lucky enough to own a fur cloak could wrap it tight and create a cocoon of warmth, while others might share larger hides laid across multiple sleepers. The quirky tidbit is that people sometimes used entire animal hides with the heads and tails still attached as blankets. Picture it, you're trying to drift off while the lifeless face of a goat or calf stares at you from your chest. Not exactly soothing bedtime decor, but you'd be warmer than the fellow next to you who only had a thin wool cloak. There are also tales of soldiers borrowing their horses' blankets for the night, muttering apologies as the animal shivered under the stars. Survival sometimes meant improvising with whatever furry surface was available. Historians as always debate the details. Did everyone really have access to fur, or was it mostly a luxury of the wealthy chronicles mention kings and lords wrapped in ermine-lined cloaks, a dazzling symbol of wealth, while peasant inventories list humbler sheepskins? Some argue that the ordinary soldier rarely touched fur, surviving on wool alone. Others point to archaeological remains showing traces of rabbit and goat hair in bedding layers, hinting that even the common folk found ways to use animal skins. The disagreement lingers like the scent of old hides, strong and hard to ignore. Now imagine yourself pulling that fur cloak tighter, its heavy pressing into your shoulders, almost pinning you down. The smell is unmistakable, a mix of lanolin, musk and smoke from last night's fire. It's not glamorous, but it's oddly comforting, like being wrapped in a living shield. Each breath warms the air trapped between the fur and your skin, creating a bubble of survivable space in an otherwise freezing world. Modern aside, we may wrinkle our noses at the thought, but think of how many of us own faux fur throws fleece jackets or down comforters. The principle is the same: borrow warmth from something that once belonged to the animal kingdom. Today you buy it at IKEA. Back then you hunted it, traded for it, or prayed you inherited it. Either way, the result was the same: you could finally sleep without trembling. The wind rattles the canvas again, sending a shiver through the tent, but you stay tucked inside your fur cocoon. The fire pit has died down, the straw shifts beneath you, and all that remains between you and the night is the dense barrier of fur. You close your eyes, breathing slower, sinking deeper, but you're not alone. In fact, in many medieval tents, furs weren't the only source of warmth. Sometimes the warmth came from the person lying right beside you. You shuffle in the dark, fur cloak pulled tight, and bump into another body. At first your tense instinct whispers danger, but then you realize it's just your tent mate. In the freezing night, sharing body heat wasn't awkward. It was survival. Two bodies pressed close could mean the difference between shivering all night or waking up with enough warmth in your bones to march at dawn. Soldiers, pilgrims, and even nobles knew this secret sometimes: the best heater was a human. The historical fact is clear across Europe and beyond: communal sleeping was normal, especially in cold seasons. Families often piled into one bed at home. On campaign, soldiers crammed into tents together, wrapped in cloaks and blankets, and huddled like a bundle of firewood. Chronicles mention bundling not in the romantic sense, but in the literal one, lining up shoulder to shoulder so warmth wasn't lost. In some cases, they even slept head to foot to minimize arguments over stolen blankets and reduce the awkwardness of too much closeness. The quirky tidbit: some commanders apparently encouraged group sleeping, reasoning that morale improved when men weren't freezing alone. One tale describes an entire company of archers joking that they were married to the man beside them for the winter. Another records travelling merchants who rented beds by the body, not by the night. The more sleepers you crammed in, the cheaper it was, and the warmer too. It's like the medieval version of budget travel hostel dorms, but with more hay and fewer rules about snoring. Historians unsurprisingly debate how willingly soldiers embraced this closeness. Some argue it was purely practical, while others suggest there was camaraderie, even comfort, in the arrangement. A few sceptical voices note that chroniclers might have exaggerated the all-in-one bed image for dramatic effect to highlight hardship or loyalty. Yet the archaeological record of tightly packed tent rows, plus countless folk sayings about warmth in numbers, makes it hard to deny. The practice was real, even if the feelings about it were complicated. Now imagine yourself in that situation. You're lying shoulder to shoulder with comrades who smell like smoke, sweat, and wet wool. One snores, another mutters in his sleep, and a third keeps shifting, stealing more of the shared fur. It's irritating, but every time you lean away, the cold slithers in and reminds you why you're here in the first place. You sigh, scoot back into the warmth, and try to ignore the chorus of snores. There's a modern echo here too. Think of camping trips where friends squeeze into a tent and wake tangled in sleeping bags, or of survival guides that bluntly advise, if stranded, share body heat. The principle hasn't changed in centuries. People are warmer together. The only difference now is we might laugh about it, call it awkward, or make jokes. Back then it wasn't a punchline, it was a necessity. The wind outside howls like a ghost at the canvas walls. Inside, the tangle of bodies grows still, the heat trapped beneath layers of cloaks and fur. You drift half asleep, lulled by the rhythm of breathing around you, grateful for every heartbeat adding warmth to the tent. Yet body heat alone wasn't enough for long nights. That's when people turned to another trick, something solid, glowing, and deceptively simple. Hot stones warmed by fire slipped under bedding like ancient hot water bottles. You stir in the darkness, pulling the fur cloak tighter, and then you feel it warmth that doesn't come from a body beside you. Under your feet, wrapped in cloth, is a smooth stone that radiates a faint heat. Someone thought ahead, placed it by the fire earlier, then tucked it into the bedding before sleep. Primitive, yes. Effective, absolutely. In that moment, the stone feels like a miracle, a hot water bottle born centuries before plumbing. Here's the historical fact: medieval people often used heated stones, bricks, or even pieces of iron to warm their sleeping spaces. After sitting in the coals, these objects were wrapped in cloth or straw and slipped under blankets. The heat lasted for hours, taking the edge off the bitter cold. Wealthier households sometimes had metal bed warmers, shallow pans with coals inside that could be slid between the sheets. In a tent, though, the low-tech version was more common stones carefully chosen for smoothness so they wouldn't tear the fabric. The quirky tidbit: sometimes people used livestock to charge their bedding. In barns or rural shelters, folks would warm bricks directly in dung fires. Yes, you heard that right, and then carry them inside. The smell was atrocious, but the heat was worth it. And there are records of soldiers using their helmets as improvised warmers, filling them with embers, heating a stone inside, and then transferring the stone to their bedding. It's like a medieval version of multi-purpose cookware. Eat soup from it by day, warm your toes with it by night. Historians predictably debate how widespread this practice was among common soldiers versus nobles. Some argue heated stones were a luxury since you needed spare fabric to wrap them in, and most soldiers barely had enough to cover themselves. Others note that archaeological evidence of scorched stones in camp remains suggests the practice was surprisingly common, especially in prolonged sieges where survival depended on ingenuity. Did every man have a hot stone? Probably not. But enough did that the technique became part of camp folklore. Now close your eyes and imagine the sensation, the weight of a smooth stone pressed against your ankles, radiating gentle heat, long after the fire has gone out. The cold around you still gnaws, but your feet, so often the first to freeze, stay warm. It's the kind of small comfort that feels enormous in the middle of the night. You wriggle deeper into the straw, grateful for this stolen ember's glow. And here's the modern aside: today we plug in electric blankets, fill rubber bottles with hot water, or even use heated mattress pads. But the principle hasn't changed. Humans love to trap heat in small portable packages. The only difference is the medieval version left soot stains on your hands and sometimes cracked if you got too eager. The wind whistles at the tent seams again, but you're calmer now, cushioned between the warmth of others and the steady pulse of heat from your hidden stone. You drift in and out of dreams, half hearing the pop of embers outside, half smelling the faint tang of scorched cloth. And when you stir awake thirsty from the heat, you remember another medieval ritual, sipping something warm before sleep to chase the chill from inside your chest. That's when you reach for the leather flask of ale warmed by the fire and take a slow, hopeful drink. You lift the flask to your lips and the first sip rolls down your throat, warm and sharp. It's not the crisp lager you'd order at a modern bar, but a cloudy, yeasty medieval ale, thick enough to chew almost. Heated by the fire, it's somewhere between soup and drink, and in this bitter night it feels like medicine. Medieval people swore by the practice a warm drink before bed could coax sleep, calm nerves, and most importantly keep the frost from creeping into your chest. The historical fact is that warm ale mead or even spiced wine was common as a nightcap. Alcohol thinned the blood and gave the illusion of warmth, tricking the body into feeling comfortable, at least for a little while. Recipes for posset, as warm milk and ale mixture curdled with herbs, circulated in medieval households as a cure for colds and a comfort before sleep. Soldiers on campaign didn't always have the luxury of spices, but even a warmed cup of rough beer could do the trick. It wasn't so much the alcohol as the heat itself, something that soothed the throat and gave the illusion that the night might be survivable. The quirky tidbit: people sometimes dropped hot stones straight into their drinks to heat them. Imagine that: plucking a glowing rock from the fire with tongs, dunking it into your mug, and listening to the hiss as ale boiled and frothed around it. The result was smoky scalding and sometimes full of grit, but undeniably warm. There's even mention of soldiers spicing their ale with pepper or mustard seed, believing it would burn away the chill. Medieval mixology wasn't subtle. It was whatever kept your teeth from chattering. Historians still argue how beneficial this ritual actually was. Some claim warm ale genuinely helped people sleep, the alcohol easing them into slumber. Others argue it was dangerous. Alcohol lowers core body temperature, meaning the sleeper might feel warm while their body cooled dangerously. Did it save lives, or did it cost them? The debate lingers, with chroniclers praising the comfort of hot drink, while modern scholars shake their heads and mutter about hypothermia. You can almost taste it now, bitter, smoky, rough on the tongue. Your stomach clenches a little, but warmth spreads from your chest to your fingertips. It's not comfortable in the way hot chocolate on a snowy evening is, but it's comfort enough. You lean back, flask resting against your chest, and close your eyes. Around you, men mutter in half-sleep, the fire crackles, the tent flaps groan. You feel a little drowsy, a little dizzy. And that was the point. Modern aside, it's funny to think how we still do the same thing. A hot toddy before bed, mulled wine at Christmas, chamomile tea in winter. It's all the same principle. Warmth in the belly makes sleep easier. The medieval version just came with fewer marshmallows and more ash floating on top. Your eyelids grow heavy as the ale works its magic. The world around you blurs and the rhythmic sound of breathing fills the tent. But as you drift towards sleep, one last thought nags at you. No matter how warm the cloak, how thick the bedding, it would all be worthless if your feet froze. And that's why medieval people gave their boots a place of honour by the fire drying, ready to save them come morning. You wake with a start in the middle of the night, and the first thing you do is reach for your boots. They're not on your feet, but sitting carefully propped near the fire pit. In a medieval tent, boots were as precious as blankets, sometimes more. Warm feet could mean a full night's sleep. Frozen damp boots could mean frostbite, lameness, or death on the march. Soldiers treated them like lifelines, because in many ways they were. Here's the historical fact: keeping boots dry and warm was a central task in any winter camp. Leather stiffened horribly in the cold, sometimes freezing into shapes that made them impossible to wear. If you put on frozen boots at dawn, you'd hobble instead of march. Medieval armies marched on their feet, not on their stomachs. Napoleon's famous line would have been better written that way. Dry boots, dry socks, dry wrappings. This was survival strategy. The quirky tidbit is that sometimes soldiers literally slept with their boots under their heads, using them as pillows. This wasn't for comfort. Boots don't exactly cradle your dreams. It was to guard against theft. In cold campaigns, boots were so valuable that men stole them from their comrades at night. Imagine waking up to find your shoes gone, your toes curling into the frost, while the thief is miles away marching warm. Another trick was to line boots with straw or moss overnight to keep them from stiffening, so you'd slip into something almost soft in the morning. Historians still argue how disciplined medieval armies really were about boot care. Some chronicles praise their preparation, with entire squads assigned to drying gear by the fire. Others describe chaos where boots cracked, rotted, and left men crippled on campaign. Letters from knights complain of losing men not to battle, but to the rot of the feet, which today we might recognize as trench foot. The debate lingers: were medieval armies meticulous about their boots, or perpetually suffering because of them? The truth was probably a little of both. You imagine yourself lifting a boot from beside the fire. The leather is warm, pliable, almost soft, and the smell of smoke clings to it. It's not luxury, but it's better than sliding your foot into a frozen block at dawn. You wiggle your toes inside, sighing in relief. In the silence of the tent, that small comfort feels immense. Here's the modern aside: think of how we treat sneakers or winter boots today. If your socks get wet, you toss them in a dryer. If your shoes stiffen, you shrug and wear another pair. But in the medieval world, there was no other pair. Boots were expensive, hard to replace, and essential for every step of survival. You didn't just own boots, you relied on them the way you rely on Wi-Fi now. The fire sputters, boots gleam faintly in the glow, and the rhythm of breathing in the tent continues. You pull your cloak tighter, glance at the boots once more, and let your head rest on your arm. Sleep presses down again, heavier this time, and as you drift, you realize there's still one part of your body unprotected: your head. That's why in medieval winter tents nobody dared sleep without a woolen nightcap or hood pulled tight. You roll over on the straw, tugging your cloak tighter, and the icy air instantly brushes your forehead. It's like a cold hand pressing against your skull, waking you just enough to remember your head is uncovered. In a medieval tent that was practically asking for misery. The body loses surprising amounts of heat through the head, and without central heating or insulated walls, people quickly learned the importance of nightcaps, hoods, or anything that wrapped their skull in warmth. The straightforward fact: medieval sleepers almost always wore something on their heads at night. A woolen coif, a knitted cap, or simply the hood of a cloak pulled low. These weren't fashion choices, they were survival gear. Manuscripts and inventories list night hoods alongside cloaks and blankets, showing they were considered basic necessities. Peasants might use a simple linen or wool cap, while nobles slept in elaborately tailored hoods lined with fur, sometimes even perfume, to mask the damp scent of wool. Without one, your ears froze, your nose dripped, and sleep became a battle instead of a refuge. Here's the quirky tidbit: nightcaps in the medieval world were sometimes tied under the chin, creating a snug, almost bonnet-like look. Practical, yes. Attractive, not even close. There are satirical poems from the era poking fun at men who looked ridiculous in their sleep hoods, comparing them to squawking birds or children in swaddling clothes. But no one cared how silly you looked if it meant waking up with ears intact. Better mocked than frostbitten. And then comes the scholarly debate. Historians disagree on whether nightcaps were universal or mostly a luxury. Some argue that only wealthier folk had designated sleep hoods, while commoners simply reused daytime coifs or pulled cloaks overhead. Others insist the practice was widespread, pointing out that head coverings appear so often in accounts of winter that it's hard to imagine anyone sleeping bareheaded by choice. The truth may be a spectrum. Nobles had fancy versions, soldiers improvised, and peasants relied on whatever scraps of cloth were available. Picture the sensation: you tug a woolen hood over your head. The fabric's scratchy but snug. Your ears are cocooned, your scalp protected, and suddenly the cold air doesn't sting as sharply. The cap traps your breath, warming the space around your face. It feels heavy, almost oppressive, but at last you're safe from the freezing drafts that snake through the tent's seams. Modern aside, think about the way we bundle up today: beanies, knit caps, or even pulling a hoodie string tight until you resemble a medieval monk. We laugh at how ridiculous it looks, but the instinct is the same. The human brain knows warmth at the head equals comfort everywhere else. Medieval people weren't being quaint, they were being practical. You nestle deeper into your bedding hood, pulled low, and let your body settle. The crackle of the fire fades, the tent sighs with the wind, and for a moment you almost feel cozy. Yet you know the ground beneath you is still unforgiving, leaching warmth, even through straw. That's why some sleepers took the next step, spreading entire animal skins beneath them, turning the floor into a patchwork of fur and hide. You shift on your makeshift bedding, straw crunching beneath your shoulders, and realize that even with a wool cloak and a hood, the cold from the ground still seeps up. It's relentless, like lying on a block of ice. That's when the true luxury item comes into play: animal skins spread across the floor. Furs weren't just for pulling over your body, they were laid down beneath you, creating a barrier far better than straw alone. In the middle of a winter camp, that layer could feel like the difference between sleeping and shivering all night. The straightforward fact is simple animal skins were widely used as floor coverings in tents, houses, and even monasteries. Cattle hides, sheepskins, or deer skins, whatever was available, could be tanned and stretched across the floor, instantly making a room or a tent warmer. The skin created a shield that straw alone couldn't match, keeping dampness from rising and reducing the heat loss that bled into the ground. Nobles and wealthy soldiers sometimes carried actual rugs or layered furs, while common men scavenged whatever hides they could find from butchering or trading. The quirky tidbit hides often came complete with tails, ears, or even heads left attached, especially in rough army camps, where no one bothered to trim them neatly. You might lie down to sleep and feel a stiff deer tail poking your ankle, or wake up staring into the stitched face of a cow. Not exactly bedtime luxury, but at least you were warmer. Some travellers even bragged about their bed of wolfskins, as if the more intimidating the animal, the more protective the sleep. It became a kind of bravado. Look at me, I'm sleeping on a predator. Historians still argue whether this was widespread practice or mostly a luxury of the well-equipped. Chronicles of noble campaigns describe pavilions carpeted in hides, suggesting elite comfort, but evidence from more humble sites shows scraps of hide used alongside straw proof that common soldiers made do with smaller, rougher pieces. Some scholars suggest that furs beneath the body were actually more effective than furs above, since heat loss was greater downward than upward. Others dismiss this as hindsight, claiming the hides were more about status than science. You stretch out feeling the imagined warmth of a thick hide beneath your back. It's smoother than straw, warmer too, and far less prickly. The earthy smell of leather fills your nostrils, mixing with smoke and sweat. The floor no longer feels like an enemy, it feels neutral, maybe even slightly welcoming. In that little victory, sleep creeps closer. And here's the modern aside, think about your fluffy bedside rug or faux fur throw blanket. They're decoration now, but their medieval ancestors were practical tools. We lay rugs for coziness, they laid hides for survival. Every scrap of fabric or fur served a purpose. Nothing was wasted when warmth was the prize. The tent around you creaks as the wind tugs harder, rattling poles and snapping ropes. Someone stirs beside you, mutters, then drifts back off. You nestle deeper into the skins, pulling your cloak tighter, almost comfortable now. Almost. Because in a camp like this, even the best bedding meant nothing if the fire died and no one was there to feed it. That's why someone always had the worst job of all, getting up in the middle of the night to keep the embers alive. You're finally drifting your body wrapped in wool and fur, the ground softened by straw, and hides when a rough hand nudges your shoulder. Your turn. The words cut through the haze of sleep. You blink, sit up, and feel the bitter air clamp down on your lungs. Outside, the wind moans, and inside the fire is a faint glow, a single ember struggling in the ash. It's midnight guard duty, not for the enemy, but for the flames. The historical fact is straightforward. In winter camps, someone always had to tend the fire through the night. Embers died quickly in cold winds, and without a living flame the tent would freeze. Soldiers rotated shifts, dragging themselves awake at awful hours to throw wood, peat, or dung onto the coals. The task wasn't glamorous, but without it the whole group risked waking to frost inside their blankets. In some cases, guard duty literally meant guarding the fire as much as guarding against surprise attack. Here's the quirky tidbit: medieval people sometimes buried embers in ash to store them overnight, insulating them from the cold so they could be revived in the morning. It's like a primitive slow cooker, except instead of stew you woke up with the hope of fire. In emergencies, people even carried live embers from place to place in little metal boxes, portable heat and light smouldering away as a traveller's companion. Imagine carrying your own personal coal in a lunchbox just to avoid striking flint in the freezing dark. Historians debate how much of this duty fell on rank-and-file soldiers versus servants and squires. Some argue that common men always took turns creating a kind of shared misery. Others suggest that wealthier warriors foisted the responsibility onto their attendants, who endured the cold while their lords snored peacefully. Archaeological remains of burned-out campfires and siege sites seem to suggest both: some fires well maintained, others abandoned midnight, their ashes scattered as if no one had the will to keep them alive. Now picture yourself crouched beside the pit, feeding it scraps of wood. Your breath puffs white, your fingers ache, and your knees press into frozen ground. The fire hisses spits, and then slowly revives, orange light blooming against the canvas walls. Shadows dance again, flickering like restless spirits. For a moment you're the sole heartbeat of warmth in a world of cold. Everyone else snores on, oblivious to the fact that your shivering body is the reason they'll wake up alive. Modern aside, it's not so different from working the graveyard shift today. Someone has to keep the lights on while the rest of the world sleeps. The only difference is instead of feeding servers or factories, you're literally feeding a pile of burning sticks. Still, the sense of lonely responsibility is the same, you against the night keeping something vital alive. The tent groans with the wind, the ropes strain, and the ember bed glows hotter under your care. You want to crawl back under the furs, but your turn isn't done yet. You're tired, half frozen, and maybe even a little resentful. Yet there's something oddly calming in the ritual, the crackle of flames, the steady rhythm of adding fuel, the hypnotic glow. Your eyelids droop as you watch smoke curl upward through the flap. But as the fire grows, so too do the noises of the tent, the coughing, the muttering, the unmistakable snores. And you remember warmth was only part of the struggle. Sleeping in a medieval tent meant facing the full orchestra of human sound and smell. You slump back from the fire duty done for now and try to settle again on your bedding. But as soon as your eyes close, the other battle begins, not against the cold, but against the noise. The tent filled with exhausted bodies is anything but peaceful. A chorus of snores erupts from every side, some deep and guttural others, high-pitched and whistling through congested noses. It's like lying inside a badly tuned organ, each sleeper playing his own discordant note. You tug your hood tighter as if fabric could block out the racket, but it only muffles the edges. The historical fact medieval tents, especially those in military camps, were crowded. Dozens of men sometimes crammed into a single large pavilion, each with their cloaks, boots, and weapons piled close. Ventilation was poor, and with a fire smouldering at the centre, the air quickly grew thick with smoke sweat and animal musk, from hides and bedding. Chroniclers occasionally described the interior of such tents as stifling fog, a phrase that makes you cough just imagining it. Sleep wasn't just uncomfortable, it was often suffocating. The quirky tidbit is that people often complained about the smells more than the cold. Accounts mention the reek of damp wool, unwashed feet, and spilled ale mixing into what one writer called a potion of fatigue. Some soldiers even joked that the stink of the tent was stronger than any enemy. One colourful story describes a group of knights who quarrelled not over battle tactics, but over who had to sleep next to the man with the loudest snores and the smelliest boots. Medieval humour apparently thrived even in misery. Historians debate how exaggerated these complaints were. Were tents really so unbearable, or were chroniclers embellishing for dramatic effect? Some scholars argue that men accustomed to labour and poor hygiene probably tolerated it better than we imagine, while others suggest the descriptions are entirely accurate, especially since we know lice, fleas and rodents were frequent companions. Archaeological digs at old encampments sometimes reveal layers of waste and discarded bedding, evidence that life inside those tents wasn't just noisy but downright unsanitary. You breathe deeply through your nose and instantly regret it. The smoke catches in your throat, the scent of sweat and hides presses in, and you roll onto your side trying to find a patch of cleaner air. Around you, men twitch in their sleep, cough into the darkness, or mutter nonsense as dreams tangle with reality. The canvas walls trap every sound, amplifying them, until the whole tent feels alive with restless noise. Here's the modern aside, it's not so different from trying to sleep in a crowded hostel or on a red-eye flight surrounded by strangers. There's always someone snoring, someone shifting, someone kicking your seat. The medieval version just swapped reclining chairs for straw pallets and airplane engines for the rasp of smoke-filled lungs. Different setting, same problem, you're not alone, and you can't escape the sounds of humanity. You sigh, tug the fur cloak higher, and resign yourself to the symphony of snores. Somewhere outside, the wind howls and the ropes creak, but inside the tent the orchestra drones on. Eventually your mind begins to slip between wakefulness and dreams, half cushioned by exhaustion. Yet in this world, dreams weren't dismissed as nonsense. They carried weight, meaning, and sometimes warnings. Which means that when you finally do drift off, your mind is about to enter a space just as strange as the waking camp. Your eyes finally close, and after the smoke, the snores, and the chill, your mind drifts into that other battlefield dreams. For medieval people, dreams weren't just random images stitched together by a tired brain, they were messages, warnings, even omens. You stir under your cloak caught between straw rustles and the low hum of breathing around you, and the dream feels almost as real as the tent itself. The historical fact is this: in medieval Europe, dreams were often taken seriously, shaped by religious and cultural beliefs. A vision at night could be interpreted as divine guidance, a sign of sin, or even a glimpse into the future. Pilgrims might wake claiming that a saint had appeared to them. Soldiers sometimes believed dreams of death or battle predicted the next day's outcome. Monastic manuals even included advice on how to discern dreams. Was it from God the devil or simply indigestion? Sleep, in short, wasn't just rest. It was a channel to something beyond. Now the quirky tidbit: medieval people sometimes blamed bad dreams on what they ate. Cheese onions or heavy stews before bed were thought to stir up nightmares. One medieval physician warned against beans, claiming they caused phantoms of the night. Imagine dozing in your straw bed, jolting awake from a nightmare of demons, and then cursing your dinner of garlic and peas. It's almost like the world's oldest version of don't eat spicy food before bed. Historians still argue about how much people truly believed these interpretations. Some scholars suggest dream books and guides were more symbolic than practical tools for clergy, rather than common soldiers. Others argue that ordinary folk lived by them, weaving dream omens into everyday decisions. The records show both extremes: noble chronicles describing prophetic visions before battles, and common folk tales where nightmares were blamed on witches or restless spirits. What's clear is that dreams weren't brushed off. They mattered even in the coldest, most exhausted nights. You turn in your bedding straw, crunching under your shoulder, and imagine yourself jolted awake from a dream of falling snow or faceless enemies. The tent around you is dark, but your pulse is racing, and you're not sure which world feels stranger, the dream or the one you've woken into. Maybe you whisper to a comrade about what you saw, or keep it to yourself, afraid of tempting fate. Either way, the dream lingers, stitched into the rhythm of your heartbeat. Modern aside, it's not so different today. People still look for meaning in dreams, flipping through guides that claim a snake means betrayal, or a broken tooth means anxiety. We laugh about it, but at 3 a.m, when you wake in a cold sweat, it feels real enough. Medieval sleepers just leaned into that feeling harder, convinced their dreams had weight. You pull the fur cloak tighter, half awake, half haunted by images you can't quite shake. Outside, the wind keens against the canvas, almost like voices carrying from the dream world into the waking one. And then you remember not all tents were flimsy or cramped. Some, especially for nobles, were like houses on the move. Larger, sturdier, and filled with the kind of comforts that blurred the line between camp and castle. You shift on your bedding, and the thought of those grand pavilions flickers in your mind. You blink awake, the remnants of a strange dream still clinging to you, and for a moment you forget where you are. Then you notice the canvas overhead, except it isn't sagging close to your face like in the common tents. Here the ceiling rises high, stretched taut over a wooden frame. This isn't just a tent, it's a house made of fabric and timber. Nobles on campaign didn't rough it quite like the common soldier. They brought pavilions so large and elaborate that stepping inside felt more like entering a portable hall than a temporary shelter. The historical fact is plain noble tents were often built with wooden frameworks, floors of planks, and sometimes even partitions that divided the space into rooms. Chroniclers describe brightly painted pavilions lined with cloth of gold carpets, and beds carved of oak or ash. Entire carpentry teams travelled with armies setting up these portable palaces so their lords could endure winter campaigns with at least a semblance of dignity. The contrast between a knight's warm pavilion and a foot soldier's smoke-filled lean-to could not have been starker. Here's the quirky tidbit: some of these noble tents were so grand they were mistaken for castles from a distance. One account of a French siege describes a pavilion with a peaked roof, painted bright red, towering above the camp like a cathedral spire. Another tale mentions a nobleman who insisted on bringing a portable bathtub into his winter tent, heated with coals beneath the frame, though one suspects his attendants were less enthusiastic about tending it in freezing wind. The line between luxury and absurdity was very thin. Historians still argue about how practical these grand pavilions really were. Some claim they were symbols of prestige more than survival, giant status markers meant to intimidate allies and enemies alike. Others suggest they genuinely made winter more bearable their size, allowing for safer fires, thicker bedding, and even rugs hung on walls for insulation. The truth probably lies between impressive displays that did offer comfort, though at great cost and effort. After all, someone had to carry those planks, furs, and barrels of ale across frozen fields. Imagine yourself stepping inside such a tent, the floor covered in animal hides, the air scented not just with smoke but with perfumed oils, the flicker of lamps throwing golden light across embroidered walls. Outside, soldiers huddle 3 to a blanket, but here you might find a cushioned bed, servants tending the fire, and even a small table set for late-night wine. The soundscape changes too. The wind is muted, the canvas barely trembles, and instead of snores you hear the low murmur of attendants speaking softly in the corner. Modern aside, it's hard not to see the resemblance to today's glamping. Canvas walls, wooden floors, rugs, lamps, all details you'd expect in a luxury campsite brochure. Medieval nobles were the original glampers, hauling comfort into the wilderness, while everyone else endured misery. It's almost funny to think of. While one man dreamed of angels in a lice-ridden straw bed, another was enjoying mulled wine in what amounted to a fabric mansion. You pull your cloak tighter, half imagining yourself among the nobility, then sigh. Most people didn't get this kind of shelter. For the majority, the glow of comfort came from something smaller, something humbler. A single oil lamp flickering against thin canvas walls, turning the night into a dance of light and shadow. The dream of noble comfort fades, and you find yourself back in a smaller tent, one where the only glow comes not from velvet curtains or carved bed frames, but from a single oil lamp. It sits on a low wooden stand flame, trembling inside a shallow dish, the wick fed by a blend of oil that smells faintly earthy. Its glow is uneven, soft gold that flickers against the canvas walls, stretching shadows into strange shapes that dance and shiver with every draught. In the dark of winter, this little lamp is more than light. It is companionship. The straightforward fact is this oil lamps were widely used in medieval camps. Candles too, but lamps had the advantage of burning longer and steadier when fueled properly. Olive oil was preferred in the Mediterranean, while in northern Europe lamps often burned animal fat or fish oil. Light wasn't just for convenience, it was essential. In a crowded tent, without a lamp, fumbling for gear in the dark could mean stepping on your bowstring, knocking over your spear, or tripping on your neighbour's boots. With a lamp glowing, you had at least a little command over the shadows. The quirky tidbit, people sometimes placed polished metal behind the flame to reflect and magnify the light like a medieval flashlight. Others carved little holes in wooden lampstands so the flicker of the flame projected patterns, stars, crosses, or flowers onto the tent walls. For a moment, even in the grim cold of a siege, the interior became almost whimsical, like a child's nightlight. Some accounts even describe guards dozing off to the comfort of lamp shadows, swearing they saw saints, animals, or ghosts in the shapes that wavered above them. Historians still argue how common oil lamps truly were in military tents. Some say only nobles and officers had the luxury, while ordinary soldiers relied on the communal campfire for light. Others argue that portable lamps were common in baggage trains, since even the humblest foot soldier needed a way to patch gear, check weapons, or chase away nightmares. Archaeological finds of broken lamp fragments suggest that at least some soldiers, wealthy or not, used them regularly. Imagine lying there, your eyes half open, watching the lamp's flame flutter. It throws shadows across your companions' faces, elongating noses, softening jaws, making the whole tent look like a living painting. The air smells faintly of smoke and oil, warm and sour but strangely comforting. The steady hum of the flame fills the silence left when the fire outside dies down. You don't feel quite so alone with that glow flickering. Modern aside, think about the way we rely on nightlights, desk lamps, or even the faint glow of a phone screen to settle down before bed. That soft illumination eases us into sleep, a psychological trick as much as a practical one. Medieval sleepers weren't so different. An oil lamp in a dark tent was both survival gear and comfort. It helped you find your boots, yes, but it also helped you find calm. The flame trembles as the wind presses harder against the canvas. The lamp's glow makes the shadows ripple like silent waves, hypnotic and steady. Your eyelids grow heavier as you watch, lulled by the rhythm of light. But just as sleep begins to take you, you hear something else. The murmur of voices whispers threading through the dark. It's not the lamp's shadow play. It's your tent mates talking quietly, sharing fears and gossip before surrendering to dreams. You lie still, eyes half closed while the lamp flickers. The voices around you start soft, just a murmur under the wind. At first you think you're dreaming, but no, it's your tent mates whispering in the dark. In a medieval camp, those last moments before sleep were often filled with hushed conversations. Words shared in half-light carried a special weight. It was the time for gossip, fears, prayers, or just idle talk, to keep the cold and the silence from pressing too heavily. The straightforward fact, soldiers and travellers often talked quietly at night, especially in communal tents. Chroniclers mention murmurs of strategy, jokes about rations, or simple exchanges of reassurance before sleep. For many, it was the only time of day when marching, fighting, and chores fell silent, replaced by small human voices that stitched bonds of companionship. In monasteries, even though silence was prized, there are notes of brothers whispering in their dormitories during harsh winters, tiny rule breaks in the face of long nights. Here's the quirky tidbit: medieval people sometimes believed whispering before sleep could protect them from bad dreams or evil spirits. Folk tradition suggested that sharing your fears aloud diminished their power. Others thought that whispering charms or prayers over a friend as he drifted off would guard him through the night. There are even accounts of sleep riddles, little puzzles traded in low voices designed to entertain or distract until exhaustion finally won. It was like the medieval version of bedtime stories, except with more saints and fewer dragons. Historians still argue how much of this was camaraderie and how much was necessity. Some say whispers were vital morale boosters, keeping men sane during endless campaigns. Others dismiss it as exaggeration, pointing out that many tents were too crowded and noisy for anyone to have private conversations. The truth, as usual, seems mixed in smaller groups. Whispers could weave intimacy. In larger ones, they blurred into a low drone like bees humming in a hive. Imagine yourself in that space, lying shoulder to shoulder, hearing one man joke about his boots, while another admits he's afraid of frostbite. Someone mutters a prayer, another sighs about home. The words weave together, fragile but strangely comforting, like threads in the fabric of the night. You don't join in, you just listen, drifting closer to sleep, lulled by the quiet rhythm of human voices blending with the creak of canvas and the moan of the wind. Modern aside, doesn't it feel familiar? The late-night whispers at sleepovers, the conversations with roommates after lights out, even the quiet texts buzzing in the dark when you should be asleep. That urge to reach out to share a thought before drifting away hasn't changed. It's the same impulse, separated only by centuries and technology. The lamp's glow dwindles, the whispers fade, and silence begins to reclaim the tent. Your eyelids droop, and for a brief moment you almost believe the camp has finally quieted. But not everyone in the medieval world slept in army tents. Some walked the frozen roads as pilgrims or monks, braving the winter cold with faith as their shield. Their survival strategies and their nights were different still. You wake before dawn, not to the crackle of a fire or the groan of canvas, but to the crunch of snow under sandals. Outside the army tents and noble pavilions, another kind of traveller moves through the cold night, monks and pilgrims on winter journeys. Imagine yourself stepping onto a frozen road cloak, wrapped close staff in handbreath, fogging like smoke in the starlight. You're not marching for conquest, you're walking for devotion, or for penance, or for the promise of a holy shrine. Sleeping in winter isn't just uncomfortable for you now, it's a test of faith. The historical fact, monks, mendicants, and religious pilgrims often travelled in all seasons, even winter, and they had their own methods for enduring the cold. Cloisters on pilgrimage routes sometimes offered shelter, but when none was available, travellers camped by the roadside or slept in barns huddled under coarse cloaks. Monastic rules emphasized endurance. A monk on journey was expected to accept hardship as part of his spiritual discipline. Sleep became not just rest, but an act of devotion, enduring cold as a form of imitation of Christ's suffering. Here's the quirky tidbit: some monks carried heated stones or small pilgrim flasks filled with warm liquid, much like soldiers did, but they also sometimes slept with relics or prayer tokens tucked under their cloaks. It wasn't warmth for the body, but warmth for the soul. Folk tales tell of pilgrims sleeping under bridges, convinced that the blessing of their saint's medal would keep away frostbite. One story even claims a monk awoke in a snowdrift untouched by frost, attributing it to divine protection, though modern minds might credit his exceptionally thick wool habit. Historians still argue how common it was for pilgrims to travel in the dead of winter. Some point to records of pilgrim hospitals bursting even in January, suggesting that the devout truly walked year-round. Others argue these were exceptions, that most sensible people waited for spring, and chroniclers exaggerated the devotion of the few who braved ice and snow. Still, the evidence of worn sandals, weathered cloaks, and donations for winter beds along routes like the Camino de Santiago suggests that plenty of people really did make the journey in bitter months. Now imagine yourself lying in a barn, the straw smelling of animals your only blanket, a rough habit pulled over your head. You hear the wind howl through the cracks in the boards, the cattle shifting nearby, their warmth your only comfort. Or perhaps you huddle in a roadside ditch staff clutched tight, whispering psalms as the night presses heavy. Your body aches with cold, but your mind frames it as sacrifice. Each shiver is a prayer, each sleepless moment is devotion. Here's the modern aside, it's not so far from how we talk about suffering for a goal today. Think of marathon runners or climbers pushing through blisters and exhaustion. For medieval monks, the goal was spiritual, not athletic, but the endurance was the same. The cold became proof of commitment, almost a badge of honor. The night deepens the stars wheel overhead, and the monks murmur prayers as they curl under their cloaks. You can almost hear the distant toll of a monastery bell, carried faintly by the wind, marking the hour of matins. While soldiers dream of battle and nobles nestle under fur, the pilgrims surrender their sleep to both hardship and holiness. And yet when dawn comes, even these holy men must rise, their sandals frozen stiff, their path still long. For in the world of knights, devotion wasn't always to God alone, sometimes it was to duty, to siege, and to the bitter necessity of enduring frozen battlefields. The monastery bell fades from your imagination, replaced by the harsh clang of a war trumpet. You jolt awake inside a military camp pitched before the walls of a besieged city. It's winter, and the siege has dragged on for months. The snow crunches outside, the wind howls like an enemy itself, and the tents flap angrily against their ropes. For knights and soldiers trapped in a frozen siege, the night was not only a test of patience, but of survival. The historical fact is this: winter sieges were brutally common in the medieval world. Armies couldn't always wait for fair weather campaigns dragged into the cold, and soldiers had to endure weeks or months of exposure in tents, hastily built huts, or even dugouts. Chronicles from the 100 Years' War and other long conflicts mention frostbite, hunger, and disease sweeping through camps, sometimes killing more men than the enemy's weapons. To sleep at all in those conditions was an act of stubbornness as much as necessity. Here's the quirky tidbit: some soldiers dug shallow pits beneath their tents and filled them with hot stones or coals, effectively creating underfloor heating. Others built crude bunkers out of snow itself, copying tricks from northern peoples. Snow insulates surprisingly well if you know what you're doing. One account even mentioned soldiers stuffing hay inside their armor before lying down, joking that they were sleeping in their harness. Picture that, dozing off inside a steel shell, lined with barn fluff rattling every time you roll over. Historians still argue whether knights on campaign truly suffered as badly as chroniclers describe. Some suggest that exaggerations of cold and hunger were literary devices to heighten the drama of siege narratives. Others insist the suffering was genuine, pointing to archaeological finds of frost-damaged bones and accounts of soldiers begging for cloaks and shoes from their lords. The truth is probably simple nobles had more resources, and so endured in relative comfort, while ordinary soldiers paid the heavier price in cold, disease, and exhaustion. Imagine yourself lying there, the wind sneaking under the tent flaps the walls of the enemy looming in the distance. Your straw bedding feels damp, your cloak smells of smoke, and every muscle aches from yesterday's labour. Yet you hear the quiet clink of armour, nearby men keeping weapons close even as they doze. In the distance, the muffled clang of a hammer as siege engines are worked on through the night. Sleep doesn't come easy in a place where death could arrive from arrows at dawn, or from frost long before that. Modern aside, it's a little like working through a brutal overnight shift in winter, except instead of fluorescent lights and vending machines, you've got freezing canvas and questionable ale. The monotony is the same, though. Long hours of discomfort, the body worn down sleep constantly interrupted by duty. You grit your teeth, mutter that you'll survive till morning, and try to ignore the ache of your toes. The camp groans in the nightwood creaks, and the wind lashes the canvas. Around you, men shift, cough, and whisper. The siege is as much against nature as against walls. You bury yourself deeper under your cloak, grateful for the faint warmth of straw and bodies nearby. But even then, danger lingers. For when frostbite came, and it often did, medieval people turned to remedies and cures so strange they sound like folklore today. The wind rattles the canvas again, but now the cold feels sharper, biting into fingers and toes. You flex your feet beneath the fur cloak, and for a moment you wonder what would happen if they froze. In medieval winter, camp's frostbite wasn't just a possibility, it was a constant threat. Soldiers sometimes woke with blackened toes, numb hands, or faces burned raw by icy air. With little medical knowledge, they turned to whatever remedies they could find, and many of those cures sound at best desperate. The straightforward fact frostbite and cold injury were known in the medieval period, even if they weren't named as such. Chroniclers describe men losing flesh to the frost, or soldiers left lame from winter's bite. Treatment was rudimentary. The simplest method was to rub the affected area with snow, ironically making it worse by keeping tissue cold, or to plunge frozen limbs into cold water in the hope of reviving them. Some records mention bandaging with warm cloths soaked in wine or vinegar using whatever supplies were on hand. The quirky tidbit, one bizarre cure involved smearing raw animal fat or even goose grease over the skin to seal in warmth. Another remedy prescribed by folk healers was to hold frostbitten fingers over steaming horse dung, the rising vapours thought to restore circulation. It's not exactly the kind of spa treatment you'd ask for today, but when your fingers felt like blocks of wood, you'd try anything. There are also references to carrying charms or reciting prayers specifically against frostbite, as if holy words could warm the blood. Historians still argue how effective or how widespread these remedies were. Some dismiss them as folklore with little real application. Others argue that even crude attempts like wrapping extremities in animal fat might have provided some minimal benefit, if only as insulation. The debate highlights the limits of medieval medical understanding. Survival depended less on cures and more on prevention, warm boots, shared body heat, and constant vigilance against the creeping cold. Now imagine yourself as one of those unlucky souls. You wake with your toes numb, unresponsive, and your comrades gather around. Someone rubs them with straw, another mutters a prayer, a third smears grease on them with clumsy hands. You wince, but there's no other option. The pain flares, the smell of animal fat turns your stomach, and still you hope you'll march tomorrow, hope you won't lose a foot to winter's cruelty. Modern aside, even today, frostbite is a danger in cold climates. We just have better gear and better science. But the instinct to try whatever's at hand hasn't changed. Think of home remedies people swear by for colds: garlic tea, mustard, plasters, vapor rubs. Some work, some don't, but in desperation we reach for comfort as much as cure. Medieval people were no different. You nestle deeper into your bedding, grateful that in this imaginary tent your feet are still warm. Yet you know not all survival tricks came from Europe. Soldiers and travellers sometimes borrowed methods from nomadic peoples, techniques honed on the steppes and tundras where winters were harsher still. And it was these borrowed tricks that sometimes made the difference between life and death in the cold. The fire sputters low, the tent creaks, and you think of how fragile your survival feels. But then imagine this: instead of fumbling in the cold with half-damp wool and scratchy straw, you had the knowledge of nomads, people who lived their entire lives in climates far harsher than these campaign fields. Medieval soldiers sometimes borrowed ideas from those steppe tribes, and Arctic travellers learning tricks that seemed strange but proved remarkably effective. The historical fact, Europe's contact with nomadic peoples, Mongols, Tartars, and steppe tribes, brought not just warfare but also cultural exchange. Chroniclers note that Europeans marvelled at the efficiency of felt tents called yurts, or gers, which were far warmer and sturdier than the flapping canvas of Western pavilions. Soldiers learned that layering felt mats inside tents trapped heat more effectively than wool alone. Some even copied the practice of wearing multiple soft boots, one inside another, stuffed with fur or felt to keep toes from freezing. Here's the quirky tidbit one traveller wrote of nomads heating stones, not just to place in bedding, but to drop into buckets of milk or broth before sleep, creating both a warm drink and a makeshift radiant heater. Others reported horsemen who wrapped their torsos with rawhide thongs before layering furs, believing the tightness preserved body heat. It sounds odd, but desperate soldiers copied the practice, muttering that if it works for them, it might work for us. Survival sometimes meant swallowing pride and wrapping yourself like a leather sausage. Historians debate how much of this cross-pollination truly happened on European soil. Some insist the tales of soldiers adopting nomadic tricks were exaggerated, romanticized accounts of cultural contact. Others point to archaeological evidence of felt and hide layers in camps where such materials weren't local, suggesting at least some of these ideas spread west. The truth likely lies between a mixture of admiration imitation and occasional embellishment. Imagine yourself trying it. You tuck felted mats beneath your bedding, and suddenly the cold from the ground is dulled. You wrap your boots inside extra leather, stuff them with scraps of wool, and your toes actually feel miraculously warm. The tent still rattles, the wind still moans, but for once you're not trembling like a leaf. There's wisdom in borrowing what works, even if it looks strange at first glance. Modern aside, think of how we still borrow survival hacks today. Scandinavian saunas, Inuit parkas, Mongolian yurts all have influenced the way we cope with cold even in cities. What we call innovation is often just rediscovery rebranded with modern marketing. Medieval soldiers did the same. When the frost bit hardest, they looked around and said, "Whose trick is keeping them alive? Let's copy it." The lamp flickers lower. You settle deeper into the straw layers of borrowed wisdom wrapped around your body like invisible blankets. Outside, the wind keeps howling across the camp, but inside you're cocooned in warmth, stolen from every culture that ever fought winter. Yet even with all these tricks, the question lingers, just how bad was it really? Were medieval winters in tents as brutal as the stories say, or are the historians exaggerating? The debate has lasted centuries, and it still hasn't been settled. The tent groans under another gust of icy wind, and you lie awake wondering, was it really this bad? Were medieval people constantly on the brink of freezing, or have the stories been stretched like canvas pulled too tight on its poles? Even historians today can't quite agree. The night inside the tent becomes a debate chamber, every creak of rope and every puff of smoke sparking another argument across time. The straightforward fact accounts of medieval winter camps vary wildly. Some chronicles describe soldiers dropping like flies from cold and hunger, entire armies crippled by frostbite. Others are curiously silent, focusing instead on battles and politics, as though the weather hardly mattered. Archaeologists uncover evidence of burned-out fire pits, thick bedding layers, and makeshift huts alongside tents, suggesting that people were far more resourceful than the grimmest reports allow. So, which version is true, both perhaps? Here's the quirky tidbit. One medieval chronicle describes a siege where soldiers supposedly grew so accustomed to the cold that they joked about it, claiming, "The frost is our comrade, he bites us no harder than the enemy." Another account insists men were found frozen upright like statues still clutching their weapons. These extremes may be less about reality and more about storytelling. Exaggeration, after all, made hardship sound nobler or more terrifying, depending on what the writer wanted, and the scholarly debate fierce. Some argue chroniclers dramatized winter suffering to highlight the glory of victory, or the tragedy of loss, turning frost into an invisible enemy. Others believe soldiers simply endured more than we modern people can imagine, hardened by lives already filled with physical hardship. Archaeological digs fuel the debate, further bones showing cold damage, yet campsites with signs of careful insulation. The evidence points both ways, leaving the question open. You picture yourself listening to this argument as though voices rose from the shadows of the tent itself. One scholar whispers that winter was merciless, another that people adapted more easily than we think. The truth is slippery, much like snow melting in your hand. You settle deeper under the furs, caught between two possibilities. Maybe medieval sleep was unbearable suffering, or maybe it was just another routine like sharpening swords or mending boots. Modern aside, isn't that how we tell our own stories too? One person remembers a winter storm as the worst night of their life. Another recalls it as cozy a chance to sit by candlelight and feel snug. Memory bends, exaggerates, reshapes itself to fit the story we want to tell. Medieval chroniclers weren't so different. The wind hammers again, and you exhale, watching your breath cloud in the lamplight. Perhaps you'll never know the exact truth, but you do know one thing. Some stories from medieval tents are so strange, so specific, that they're hard to dismiss as mere exaggeration. In fact, the oddest, most unusual cold weather sleeping accounts are still to come, and they might surprise you more than any battlefield tale. You lie still, your breath misting in the lamplight, and think about all the strange tricks and habits that have piled up in this winter tent. Wool, straw, fur, hot stones, shared warmth, even borrowed nomadic tricks, they all made sense in their own way. But then come the stories that sound almost too odd to be true, the stranger-than-fiction accounts of how people slept through the frost. These are the details that don't make it into the polished chronicles, but linger in the margins of letters and folk tales. The straightforward fact medieval people were inventive and sometimes desperate in their fight against the cold. There are accounts of men burrowing into haystacks to sleep entire companies, curling up in barns among livestock for the shared heat. Some built snow huts more like igloos than tents, discovering that snow itself could insulate. Others simply accepted misery, wrapping themselves in every available scrap until they resembled bundles of cloth, immobile and half buried in straw. These odd practices were real, even if they sounded peculiar. Here's the quirky tidbit: one chronicler claimed that soldiers on a bitter winter march actually tried sleeping inside the still warm carcasses of slaughtered animals, borrowing heat in the most visceral way imaginable. Whether that story is literal truth or literary exaggeration is still debated, but it's stuck passed down as a testament to the lengths men might go. Another odd detail: some travellers carried onions or garlic under their pillows, believing the sharp scent warded off frost and spirits alike. Picture it drifting to sleep with your head resting on a lumpy sack of produce, convinced it was both blanket and guardian. Historians, of course, debate these stranger tales fiercely. Some dismiss them as exaggerations meant to shock readers like medieval clickbait. Others argue that the stranger stories may hold kernels of truth. After all, survival often pushes people into absurd choices. Archaeological hints sometimes support the oddities, hay compressed in strange patterns inside abandoned barns, or food traces found in bedding layers. Was it desperation ritual or just good storytelling? The line is hard to draw. You imagine yourself curling up in a barn, cows shifting nearby their breath, warm against your cheek. It's smelly, noisy, but undeniably warmer than the frozen night outside. Or perhaps you picture sliding into a heap of hay, the sharp stalks prickling your skin but cocooning you in insulation. Odd, yes, but suddenly appealing when the wind bites at your ears. The strangest part is realizing how practical these oddities could be, no matter how bizarre they sound at first. Modern aside, think of the survival stories told today. People in snowstorms building makeshift shelters, using car engines for heat, or wrapping themselves in anything from bubble wrap to newspapers. They sound strange sometimes, even foolish until you realize they worked. Medieval people, too, reached for whatever odd solution might give them one more night of sleep. The tent creaks, the lamp guttering low, and you settle deeper, imagining the oddities that history preserved. They might make you laugh, they might make you cringe, but they also remind you of how far people would go just to rest, just to survive till dawn. And speaking of dawn, it's closer now. Outside, a bell tolls softly, calling sleepers back to the waking world. And you realize waking in a medieval winter tent could be just as difficult, just as miserable as falling asleep. The first thing you hear is not birdsong, not the cheerful crackle of a fresh fire, but the dull clang of a bell somewhere outside in the frozen camp. Its tone is heavy, slow, and it seeps into your half-dream like a reminder you don't want. Dawn. You groan beneath your fur cloak, unwilling to move, because in a medieval winter tent waking could be as hard as sleeping. The straightforward fact mornings in medieval winter camps were brutal. Cloaks and bedding, stiff with frost boots, frozen solid breath, puffing in clouds that hung inside the tent like mist. Soldiers often had to be shaken awake, not because they overslept, but because their bodies clung to sleep as the only warmth they had. Chroniclers describe men reluctant to rise until fires were rekindled, and commanders grumbling about sluggish troops moving like half-frozen oxen. The quirky tidbit: some men tried to cheat the dawn by sleeping with boots already on, and weapons at their side ready to stumble into duty. Others carried small bells themselves, strapping them near their heads, so a comrade could yank a cord and rouse them instantly. And there's one peculiar account of soldiers jokingly calling morning wake-up the second battle, since dragging yourself from straw and frost was as hard as facing an enemy. Imagine being scolded not for laziness, but for cowardice against the cold. Historians still debate how miserable these mornings truly were. Some argue soldiers grew accustomed, their bodies hardened, and the chronicles exaggerate the drama. Others believe the complaints were genuine, pointing to letters where men describe ice on their cloaks and frost crusted in their beards. Archaeological remains of fire pits rekindled at dawn suggest the struggle was real. You could not begin the day without fire. You picture yourself stirring awake, reluctant to move. The straw beneath you is damp and flat, your hood slipped off in the night and your breath fogs the air. You hear the grumble of comrades, the cough of smoke rising as someone revives the embers. The bell outside tolls again, echoing through the frozen camp. You know you must rise, pull on boots, stiff as boards, wrap your cloak tighter, and face another day of marching or waiting, hungry and tired. Modern aside, doesn't it feel familiar? That reluctance to leave bed on a cold morning when every inch of you begs to stay cocooned. We hit snooze on alarms, they groaned under bells. Different centuries, same feeling, the war between blanket and duty. The camp comes alive, slowly, men cursing their boots, servants dragging water, the wind carrying the scent of smoke. You rise at last, shaking straw from your cloak, shivering as the icy air rushes in when the tent flap opens. Dawn is no friend, but it always comes tugging you from whatever fragile warmth the night allowed. And as you step outside, boots crunching in frost, you realize the story of medieval sleep isn't just about how people endured the night. It's about how they endured every night, winter after winter, century after century, with nothing but canvas cloth fire and stubborn human will. They slept not comfortably, but enough to survive. Enough to wake, to fight, to walk, to pray. Enough to see another dawn. The bell fades into silence, and now the world softens. The tent walls no longer rattle with urgency. They sway slowly like a cradle rocked by invisible hands. The cold air loses its bite and becomes only a whisper brushing against your skin with gentleness instead of malice. You're no longer in a medieval camp, not really, you're drifting further and further from the smoke, the straw, the frost, until they feel like faint echoes in another lifetime. Your breath slows. Each inhale draws in calm, each exhale releases the weight of the night. The sounds of the camp, snoring, coughing footsteps melt away, replaced by a steady hush, as if the entire world has decided to rest with you. The canvas overhead blurs into something softer, more like clouds than fabric, and the straw beneath you transforms into a smooth, warm surface that holds you without pressing, without poking. You hear the motif of wind one last time, but now it's no longer howling. It's steady like ocean waves rolling against a distant shore. It moves through you instead of around you, carrying away any lingering chill. You're wrapped, layered not in wool and fur, but in silence, in stillness, in warmth that requires no effort. Let your body feel heavier, as if sinking just slightly deeper with every breath. There is no need to fight the cold, no need to guard the fire, no need to listen for bells or duties. All the hardships of the medieval camp dissolve, leaving only the rhythm of rest, long and slow like a lullaby stretched into eternity. You're safe, you're warm, and the night has given you its final gift, peace. Now let the last images fade into darkness, soft and quiet, until there is nothing left but sleep.